What part of restricted waters don't you understand, old man? The voice cut through the morning mist of San Diego Bay like a blade through silk, sharp with the kind of coastal authority that came from youth, a crisp uniform, and an inflated sense of importance. But what Petty Officer Second Class Danny Rodriguez couldn't see, as he stood on the bow of his Coast Guard patrol boat, was the steady hands gripping the wheel of the small fishing vessel, the same hands that had once guided a swift boat through the treacherous waters of the Mekong Delta, when a split-second decision could mean the difference between life and death for an entire crew. Robert "Iron Mike" Sullivan, 78 years old and carrying the weight of 1,000 memories in his weathered shoulders, continued his slow approach toward the naval shipyard. His boat, a meticulously restored 1970 Boston whaler he called Liberty's Call, cut through the gentle swells with the precision of a man who had been navigating dangerous waters for over half a century. The morning sun painted the San Diego skyline in shades of gold and amber, reflecting off the harbor's surface like scattered coins. Mike had been making this same run every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years, bringing fresh coffee and pastries to the civilian dock workers at the naval facility. It was his small way of staying connected to the service, of feeling useful in a world that seemed to have forgotten what he and his generation had sacrificed. Rodriguez was young, probably 25, Mike estimated from the aggressive way he positioned his patrol boat. Fresh out of training, chest full of ribbons from humanitarian missions, and absolutely certain that his authority was being challenged by some confused old fisherman who had wandered into restricted waters. "I said cut your engines and prepare to be boarded," Rodriguez commanded through his boat's loudspeaker, the electronic amplification adding an edge of mechanical menace to his already hostile tone. "This is your final warning." Mike slowly pulled back on the throttle, the steady purr of his boat's engine dying to an idle. He didn't look toward the Coast Guard vessel. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the distant outline of Naval Base San Diego, where he could see the gray hulls of destroyers and cruisers lined up like sleeping giants along the pier. Those ships stirred something deep in his chest, a mixture of pride and profound loss that the young officer shouting at him could never understand. Each vessel represented thousands of sailors, young men and women, who had volunteered to stand between their country and whatever threats might emerge from the vast Pacific, just as he had once done, in a different war, in different waters. Rodriguez saw the stillness not as dignity, but as defiance. He saw a decrepit old fishing boat and a senile retiree who was causing problems on his watch. He signaled to his boarding team, 2 other young Coast Guardsmen who were eager to follow their petty officer's lead in asserting their authority over this non-compliant civilian. "All right, prepare the boarding party," Rodriguez ordered, his voice carrying across the water with unnecessary volume. "This old-timer is about to learn what happens when you ignore Coast Guard authority." The sound of the patrol boat's engines revving higher filled the morning air as Rodriguez maneuvered closer to Mike's small vessel. The wake from the larger boat rocked the Boston whaler, but Mike's hands remained steady on the wheel, his posture unchanged. He had weathered far worse storms than this. For Rodriguez, this was shaping up to be an interesting morning, a chance to demonstrate his command presence and show his junior personnel how to handle non-compliant civilians. He had no way of knowing that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his Coast Guard career. For Mike Sullivan, the aggressive posturing and hostile commands felt hauntingly familiar. He had been in similar situations before, surrounded by uniforms and suspicious voices, questioned about his right to be where he was. The only difference was that this time, the flag on the other boat's mast was the same one he had served under for 26 years. The boarding ladder hit the side of Liberty's Call with a metallic clang that echoed across the calm waters of the bay. Other boats in the area had begun to slow, their occupants drawn by the spectacle of a Coast Guard boarding in progress. Mike could feel their curious gazes, the mixture of fascination and sympathy that civilians always showed when they witnessed someone being hassled by authorities. As Rodriguez prepared to step aboard the small fishing vessel, Mike finally turned his head. His weathered face, lined with decades of sun and salt spray, showed no fear or anger, only the patient resignation of a man who had learned long ago that some battles were fought with words, others with weapons, but the most important ones were fought simply by maintaining your dignity when others tried to strip it away. The confrontation was about to escalate in ways that none of them could imagine, setting in motion a series of events that would reverberate through the entire Pacific Fleet and remind everyone involved that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear old fishing clothes and speak with quiet voices that carry the weight of history. The thud of rubber-soled boots hitting the deck of Liberty's Call was jarringly loud in the sudden quiet that had settled over the harbor. Petty Officer Rodriguez landed first, his posture radiating aggressive confidence as he surveyed the small, immaculately maintained fishing boat with obvious disdain. Two other Coast Guardsmen followed. Seaman First Class Williams, barely 21 and eager to impress his superior, and Petty Officer Third Class Chen, a more experienced sailor who felt a growing uneasiness about the escalation he was witnessing. "Let's see some identification and vessel registration," Rodriguez commanded, his voice dripping with condescension as he looked Mike up and down. The old man wore faded jeans, a well-worn Navy surplus jacket, and a baseball cap that had seen better decades. To Rodriguez, he looked exactly like what he expected, a confused retiree who had wandered into waters where he didn't belong. "Registration current?" Rodriguez continued mockingly. "Or did you forget to renew it sometime during the Bush administration?" "The first one?" Mike reached slowly into a waterproof pouch near the helm, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He withdrew a plastic sleeve containing his boat's papers and a worn leather wallet that had traveled more miles than most people would cover in a lifetime. Rodriguez snatched the documents from Mike's weathered hands, flipping through them with theatrical efficiency. The driver's license showed Robert Michael Sullivan, age 78, with an address in Coronado. The boat registration was current, the insurance valid, all paperwork in perfect order. "You know what your problem is, Pops," Rodriguez said, handing the papers to Seaman Williams while continuing his unauthorized inspection of the boat. "You old guys think the rules don't apply to you. Think because you've been around since the Eisenhower administration, you can do whatever you want." He kicked at a tackle box near the stern, his boot connecting with the metal latch. "What have we got in here? Contraband, illegal catch, maybe some of that medical marijuana you seniors are always whining about?" Without waiting for permission, Rodriguez flipped open the tackle box. Inside, nestled among carefully organized lures and fishing line, was something that made him pause. It was a small wooden case, about the size of a jewelry box, with brass hinges that had been polished to a mirror shine despite their obvious age. "What's this?" Rodriguez asked, poking at the case with his finger. "Family heirlooms? Or are you smuggling antiques now?" Mike said nothing, his gaze drifting past Rodriguez toward the other boats that had gathered to watch the boarding. He could see people with phones out, recording what they assumed would be the routine harassment of an elderly boater. The humiliation was a familiar feeling, like a cold tide rising around his ankles. Rodriguez, emboldened by what he interpreted as submission, raised his voice for the benefit of his growing audience. "I asked you a question, old man. This is a restricted zone. A major naval exercise is scheduled to commence. You've ignored posted warnings and radio calls. You are interfering with federal operations. Exercise doesn't start for another 2 hours, Mike said quietly, his voice carrying the slight rasp of age but none of the uncertainty Rodriguez expected. "I checked the NOTAMs this morning. Channels open until 0900. "Oh, you're a maritime lawyer now," Rodriguez scoffed, his face flushing with irritation at being corrected. "My orders are to secure this water space, and that's exactly what I'm doing. Your outdated information doesn't override my direct commands." Seaman Williams looked up from his radio check, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his young face. "Petty Officer, the registration checks out. No flags, no violations on record." Rodriguez waved a dismissive hand. "I don't care about paperwork. His presence here is a direct violation of my security perimeter. He's non-compliant with lawful orders." He turned back to Mike, leaning in close enough to invade the old man's personal space. "So for the last time, explain yourself. Why are you here? Why are you ignoring federal exclusion zones? Give me one good reason why I shouldn't seize this rust bucket and haul you to shore in handcuffs." The humiliation was reaching its peak. The crowd was growing larger. The accusations were becoming more serious. Mike's hands, which had remained steady throughout the confrontation, slowly tightened into fists at his sides. He had been in this position before, surrounded by hostile uniforms, questioned about his right to exist in spaces he had earned through blood and sacrifice. But this was different. This was his own country's waters, his own service's successors treating him like a criminal. The wooden case in his tackle box seemed to radiate warmth, as if the memories it contained were trying to break free. Inside that polished box, wrapped in faded velvet, lay a small bronze medallion suspended from a ribbon of blue silk. It was not a prize from a cereal box or a participation trophy from some forgotten community event. It was the Navy Cross, America's second highest award for valor, earned on a night when the line between heroism and horror had blurred beyond recognition, when young men had died in his arms and others had lived because of decisions he had made in the space of heartbeats. But Rodriguez saw none of this history, understood none of the weight that silence could carry. He saw only an obstinate old man who needed to be taught a lesson about respecting authority. As Rodriguez's taunts echoed across the water, the gentle rocking of Liberty's call suddenly transformed into something else entirely. The calm waters of San Diego Bay dissolved, replaced by the muddy, churning brown of the Mekong Delta. The salt air became thick with cordite and the suffocating humidity of the Vietnamese jungle. It wasn't a memory, it was a ghost, a violent flashback that seized Mike without warning. The year was 1969, and boatswain's mate First Class Robert Sullivan was crouched behind the twin 50-caliber machine guns of swift boat PCF-94, his hands slick with sweat and river water as he traversed the weapon toward muzzle flashes erupting from the dense foliage along the bank. Contact left. The voice of his boat captain, Lieutenant Morrison, cut through the chaos as automatic weapons fire stitched patterns across the water around their patrol boat. "Mike, suppress that tree line." The thunderous roar of the 50 cals filled the air, their heavy slugs chewing through palm fronds and bamboo as Mike walked his fire along the suspected enemy positions. To his right, their companion swift boat was taking heavy fire, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. "They're hitting fuel lines," came the panicked radio call. "We're losing power." Without hesitation, Mike had swung his boat between the disabled vessel and the enemy shore, his hull absorbing the incoming fire meant for the wounded swift boat. For 3 hours, 3 impossible, endless hours, he had held that position, his guns never silent, his boat serving as a shield while the crew of PCF-91 fought to repair their engines. When the ammunition ran low, he had used his sidearm. When that ran dry, he had thrown grenades. When those were gone, he had used his bare hands to pull wounded sailors from the water, diving again and again into the muddy current under heavy fire. By the time helicopter gunships arrived to break the ambush, PCF-94 had taken 47 hits. Mike himself had been wounded twice, shrapnel in his shoulder, a bullet grazed along his ribs, but he had never stopped fighting. 6 men from the other swift boat owed their lives to his actions that day. The Navy Cross citation would later describe it as extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy fire, but those official words could never capture the weight of what he had carried ever since, the faces of the young sailors he had pulled from the water, some living, some not, all of them somebody's son. The flashback ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Mike standing on his fishing boat, his heart racing and his hands trembling slightly. The wooden case in his tackle box seemed to burn with the memory of that terrible heroic night. Rodriguez, oblivious to the internal storm he had triggered, continued his aggressive inspection. "What's in the box, old man? Family photos? Love letters from your high school sweetheart?" Without waiting for permission, he reached for the brass clasp. Among the growing crowd of spectators was a sleek sailing yacht named Second Wind. Its experienced captain, watching the confrontation unfold through high-powered binoculars with mounting alarm. Captain Sarah Mitchell, USN, had spent 30 years in the Navy, the last 10 as the commanding officer of a guided missile cruiser. She understood the delicate balance of authority and respect that made military operations possible, and what she was witnessing represented a catastrophic failure of both. Through her glasses, she could see the aggressive posture of the young Coast Guard petty officer, the way he invaded the elderly boater's personal space, the theatrical cruelty of his inspection. But more troubling was the old man's response, or lack thereof. Mitchell recognized something in that stillness, that patient endurance in the face of humiliation. She had seen it before in older veterans, men who had learned to simply weather storms of bureaucratic abuse, because fighting back would only make things worse. "This is wrong," she muttered, lowering her binoculars. Her husband, also a retired Navy officer, looked at her with concern. "Sarah, what is it? That Coast Guard kid is about to step in it. Big time." She was already moving toward her ship-to-shore radio, her fingers working with sudden urgency. "He's harassing a civilian without just cause, and I think that old man might be more than he appears." Mitchell had commanded too many sailors, served alongside too many veterans, to miss the signs. The way the elderly boater held himself, the precision of his boat handling, even his choice of vessel, a restored Boston whaler that looked suspiciously like the small craft used by swift boat crews in Vietnam. She bypassed the standard Coast Guard channels and went directly to the number she still had memorized after all these years, the direct line to Naval Base San Diego's Operations Center. A crisp voice answered, "Naval Base San Diego Operations, Petty Officer Davis speaking. This is Captain Sarah Mitchell, retired. I need to speak with the duty officer immediately. We have a situation developing in the main channel that requires senior attention. Ma'am, if this concerns Coast Guard operations, you should contact— Listen to me carefully, Mitchell interrupted, her command voice cutting through the young sailor's protocols. Grid reference 32.6172 main shipping channel. Coast Guard patrol boat has boarded a civilian vessel. Registration number. She rattled off the hull numbers she could see through her binoculars. They've escalated to harassment level. The civilian appears to be an elderly veteran, possibly Vietnam era. There was a pause on the other end. Ma'am, can you confirm the civilian's identity? Negative, but his vessel is named Liberty's Call, and from what I can observe, this is about to become a public relations nightmare. The Coast Guard petty officer is conducting an aggressive, possibly unlawful boarding with multiple civilian witnesses recording. Understood, ma'am. Transferring you to the command duty officer. Back on Liberty's Call, Rodriguez's investigation had reached a new level of invasiveness. He had opened every compartment, rifled through every storage space, and was now focused entirely on the wooden case and Mike's tackle box. Last chance to explain yourself, Pops, Rodriguez said, his fingers on the brass clasp. What's in the mystery box? And don't tell me it's fishing lures. Mike finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made Petty Officer Chen step back involuntarily. That's private property. You have no legal authority to search personal effects without probable cause. Probable cause? Rodriguez laughed harshly. How about violation of a security perimeter? How about failure to comply with lawful orders? How about being a smart-mouth old man who thinks he knows more than the Coast Guard? He flipped open the case. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay the Navy Cross, America's second-highest decoration for valor. The bronze medal gleamed despite its age, its ribbon still showing traces of the deep blue that had once been vibrant. Beneath it, in a plastic sleeve, was a folded citation bearing the seal of the United States Navy. Rodriguez stared at the medal for a moment, clearly not recognizing its significance. To him it looked like any other old military decoration, the kind of participation trophy that every veteran seemed to have collecting dust in their closets. Well, well, he said mockingly. Look what we have here. A war hero. Let me guess, you single-handedly won Vietnam, saved the whole platoon, killed 100 enemy soldiers with your bare hands? The sarcasm in his voice carried across the water, and several of the civilian boaters watching the confrontation shifted uncomfortably. Even those who didn't recognize the specific decoration could sense that something significant was being mocked. Seaman Williams, despite his youth and inexperience, felt a growing uneasiness about the direction things were taking. Petty officer, he said quietly, you should shut up and let me handle this, Rodriguez snapped. He held up the Navy Cross, examining it with theatrical disdain. You know what I think, Grandpa? I think you bought this at a pawn shop. Or maybe it belonged to some real hero, and you're just keeping it as a souvenir. The accusation of stolen valor hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. It was the one insult that could penetrate even Mike's legendary patience, the one attack that struck at the core of everything he had endured and sacrificed. Around them, the crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly a dozen boats, their occupants watching with a mixture of fascination and growing outrage. Cell phone cameras captured every moment of the confrontation, broadcasting the humiliation of an elderly veteran to social media platforms where the footage would soon go viral. Mike's hands, which had remained steady throughout the boarding, finally began to tremble, not with fear but with a rage so profound it threatened to break through 60 years of learned self-control. In the climate-controlled quiet of Naval Base San Diego's Operations Center, Lieutenant Commander Jessica Torres took Captain Mitchell's transferred call with the weary resignation of an officer who had dealt with countless civilian complaints about Coast Guard operations. Captain Mitchell, this is Lieutenant Commander Torres, Command Duty Officer. I understand you have concerns about a boarding in progress? Commander, I need you to run a vessel registration for me. Hull number November Charlie 7792 Delta. The owner's name should be Robert Sullivan. I believe this situation is about to escalate beyond anyone's control. Torres dutifully entered the information into her computer, expecting to see the usual civilian boater profile, fishing licenses, maybe a Coast Guard auxiliary membership, perhaps a few minor infractions. Instead, her screen filled with security flags and access restrictions. Ma'am, she said slowly, her voice changing from routine patience to sharp attention. I'm going to need you to hold while I verify this information. Torres had seen restricted files before, but never one flagged at this level. The civilian database entry for Robert Sullivan was heavily encrypted, with multiple security classifications, and a warning that required immediate notification of senior command for any law enforcement contact. With growing alarm, she typed in her access codes and watched as the file began to populate. The first line that appeared made her blood run cold. Sullivan, Robert Michael, BM1 USN. Navy Cross recipient, combat veteran, Vietnam, swift boat operations. Jesus Christ, she whispered, her professional composure cracking. She immediately picked up the red phone that connected directly to the base commander's quarters. Admiral Patricia Hayes answered on the second ring, her voice crisp despite the early hour. Hayes, Admiral, this is Torres in operations. We have an immediate situation in the main channel. A Coast Guard patrol has boarded a civilian vessel, and the owner is... She paused, double-checking her screen. Ma'am, he's a Navy Cross recipient, Vietnam veteran, swift boat commander. The witness reports indicate the boarding has escalated to harassment level. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Admiral Hayes had commanded Pacific Fleet operations for 3 years, and she understood immediately the magnitude of what Torres was telling her. Are you certain of the identification? Confirmed, ma'am. Robert Michael Sullivan, boatswain's mate first class, retired. Citation indicates extraordinary heroism during river patrol operation. God damn it, the Admiral said, her usual diplomatic composure forgotten. Get me the Coast Guard district commander on the line, now, and prep my helicopter. I'm going out there personally. Ma'am, should I contact the vessel directly? Negative. Radio communications might escalate the situation, but I want every available surface unit in the area to converge on those coordinates, quietly. No sirens, no drama, just presence. Torres began implementing the Admiral's orders with the efficiency that had made her one of the Navy's rising stars. Within minutes, 3 patrol boats, 2 harbor security vessels, and a Coast Guard response team were discreetly moving toward the coordinates where an elderly veteran was being humiliated by the very service branch he had once served alongside. Back on Liberty's call, Rodriguez had reached the point of no return. Holding the Navy Cross up to the growing crowd of onlookers, he continued his public humiliation of Mike Sullivan with the confidence of someone who had no idea what forces he was setting in motion. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced theatrically, we have ourselves a genuine war hero here. Or at least, that's what he wants us to believe. He tossed the medal back into its case with deliberate disrespect, the bronze clattering against the wooden sides. You know what I see? I see an old man living in the past, trying to impress people with someone else's courage. The accusation of stolen valor was a bridge too far. Around the harbor, even the civilian observers began to sense that something deeply wrong was happening. These were San Diego waters, home to one of the largest naval communities in the world, where respect for military service ran deep, and the desecration of earned honors was considered sacrilege. Mike Sullivan, who had remained silent through insults, threats, and invasion of his property, finally found his voice. When he spoke, it was not with the anger Rodriguez expected, but with the quiet authority of a man who had faced death and learned that dignity was the only thing no one could take from you unless you surrendered it willingly. Son, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the water, that uniform you're wearing, I wore one like it for 26 years, and I learned something that maybe they didn't teach you in your training. Rodriguez paused, momentarily taken aback by the sudden change in Mike's demeanor. The uniform doesn't make you a man, Mike continued, his pale blue eyes meeting Rodriguez's with unblinking directness. Your actions do. Your respect for others does. Your understanding that every person you meet might have a story you don't know, sacrifices you can't imagine. Save the lecture for someone who cares, Rodriguez shot back, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Something in the old man's tone, the way he carried himself, was triggering warning signals that Rodriguez was too proud to heed. You want to know about this medal? Mike asked, reaching past Rodriguez to gently lift the Navy Cross from its case. It was earned on a night when good men died, and others lived because someone made the choice to stand between them and the enemy. It's not about glory or recognition. It's about doing what needs to be done when everything goes to hell. He held the medal in his weathered palm, its bronze surface catching the morning sunlight. I've worn this uniform in combat, son. I've made decisions that kept people alive and got others killed. I've carried bodies of friends to helicopters and watched young men die in places their families can't even pronounce. The dock workers on nearby boats had stopped their morning routines to listen. The civilians recording the confrontation found themselves holding their phones steady. sensing they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine boarding. "So when you mock this medal," Mike continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the air around them, "you're not just mocking me. You're mocking every sailor who ever stood a watch, every Marine who ever walked point, every soldier who ever chose to serve something bigger than himself." Rodriguez felt the ground shifting beneath him, sensed that the easy authority he had been exercising was somehow slipping away. But pride and embarrassment drove him to double down. "Enough," he shouted, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for failure to comply with lawful orders, violation of a security perimeter, and interfering with federal operations. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The metallic click of the cuffs opening echoed across the water like a gunshot. The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came as a vibration felt more than heard, a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate through the water itself and into the hulls of every vessel in the harbor. Rodriguez paused, handcuffs still extended, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as he looked toward the harbor mouth. The sound was growing, deepening into the unmistakable chorus of massive naval engines running at high speed. Then they appeared. Breaking through the morning haze at the harbor entrance was not a single ship, but a formation that represented the full power and majesty of the United States Navy. Leading the procession was the USS Zumwalt, the Navy's most advanced destroyer, its angular stealth profile cutting through the waves like a predatory shark. Flanking it were two Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, their Aegis radar arrays rotating slowly as they maintained perfect formation. Behind them came a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, its hull bristling with missile tubes and defensive systems. And bringing up the rear, so massive it seemed to block out the horizon, was the USS Abraham Lincoln, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, whose flight deck was lined with Fa-18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning fighters. The entire formation was moving at flank speed directly toward the coordinates, where Liberty's call bobbed in the gentle swells, surrounded by Coast Guard personnel who were beginning to understand that they had stumbled into something far beyond their comprehension. A roar split the morning air as a flight of 4 Blue Angels demonstration jets, diverted from a nearby air show, screamed overhead at low altitude. They weren't flying a combat pattern. This was a ceremonial flyby, wings dipped in the traditional salute reserved for the most honored occasions. The precision timing, the overwhelming display of naval power, all converging on this single point in San Diego Bay, sent an unmistakable message: the United States Navy was honoring one of its own. Rodriguez and his boarding party stood frozen, their mouths agape as they watched the greatest naval power on Earth execute a show of respect that hadn't been seen since the funeral of Admiral Nimitz himself. The lead destroyer, USS Zumwalt, came to a halt barely 100 yards away, its massive bulk casting Liberty's call in shadow. Along the destroyer's rail, from bow to stern, stood hundreds of sailors in their dress-white uniforms, manning the rails in perfect formation. It was the highest honor the Navy could bestow, a gesture reserved for heads of state, fallen heroes, and legends of the service. The destroyer's horn sounded 3 long blasts, the traditional salute that echoed across the water and reverberated off every hull in the harbor. Then, amplified by the ship's powerful public address system, came a voice that carried with the authority of the entire Pacific Fleet: Boatswain's Mate First Class Robert Michael Sullivan, United States Navy. The announcement boomed across the water, formal and precise. The United States Pacific Fleet is honored to render honors to a distinguished veteran and recipient of the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat operations. Rodriguez felt his legs go weak. The handcuffs slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the deck of Liberty's call. His face had gone from red with anger to white with dawning horror. The name meant nothing to him personally, but its effect on the most powerful naval force in the world was undeniable. He had been about to arrest a man who commanded this level of respect from admirals and fleet commanders. The destroyer captain's voice continued over the public address system, reading from a document that transformed the morning confrontation into something approaching a religious ceremony. The President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Navy Cross to Boatswain's Mate First Class Robert Michael Sullivan, United States Navy, for extraordinary heroism while serving as boat captain of River Patrol Craft PCF-94 during combat operations against enemy forces in the Republic of Vietnam. As the citation unfolded, painting a picture of heroism that seemed almost fictional in its scope, the civilian boats that had gathered to watch a routine boarding found themselves witnesses to something far more profound: the public vindication of a warrior whose service had been mocked by ignorance and arrogance. On the night of September 15, 1969, Petty Officer Sullivan's patrol came under intense enemy fire from concealed positions along both banks of the Mekong River. When the companion patrol boat suffered engine damage and began taking on water, Sullivan maneuvered his vessel between the disabled craft and the enemy positions, absorbing heavy automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenade fire. The waters around them had become a natural amphitheater, with naval vessels forming a protective circle and civilian boats maintaining respectful distance, as the story of that distant night was told to a generation that had never known such warfare. For over 4 hours, under continuous enemy fire, Petty Officer Sullivan maintained his position, providing covering fire while effecting the rescue of 7 wounded personnel from the water. Despite suffering multiple wounds himself, he continued to engage enemy positions with his vessel's machine guns until helicopter gunships arrived to break the ambush. Rodriguez stood paralyzed, understanding for the first time the magnitude of his error. The old man he had been mocking, threatening to arrest, was an authenticated hero whose actions had saved lives under conditions that would have broken lesser men. Petty Officer Sullivan's extraordinary heroism, outstanding courage, and selfless devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service and reflect great credit upon himself and the naval service. As the citation concluded, the hundreds of sailors manning the rails of the surrounding vessels raised their hands in a synchronized salute that created a forest of white-gloved hands against the blue Pacific sky. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against hulls and the distant cry of seagulls. In that silence, 60 years of history settled over the confrontation like morning fog, transforming a routine boarding into a moment that would be remembered as long as the Navy sailed. The sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the direction of Naval Base San Diego announced the arrival of someone whose presence would formalize what had already become clear to everyone in the harbor. This was no longer a Coast Guard boarding, but a Navy ceremony. Admiral Patricia Hayes, commander of Pacific Fleet, had not planned to spend her morning in the main channel of San Diego Bay, but some situations demanded the personal attention of flag officers. As her helicopter settled into a hover over the destroyer's flight deck, she reflected on the delicate balance between inter-service cooperation and the absolute requirement to protect the honor of naval veterans. The Admiral was transferred to the destroyer via helicopter, then to a rigid-hull inflatable boat for the final approach to Liberty's call. Accompanying her was the destroyer's commanding officer, Captain Robert Chen, and the Pacific Fleet's senior enlisted advisor, Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Williams. As the RHIB approached Mike Sullivan's fishing boat, Admiral Hayes could see the tableau that had developed. An elderly veteran standing with quiet dignity beside his helm, surrounded by Coast Guard personnel who were beginning to understand the enormity of their mistake, all under the watchful eyes of the most powerful naval force on Earth. The Admiral came aboard Liberty's call with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 3 decades moving between naval vessels. Her first action was to approach Mike Sullivan directly, ignoring the Coast Guard personnel entirely. "Boatswain's Mate Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her rank, but tempered with genuine respect. "I apologize for the circumstances that brought us together, but I want you to know that the United States Navy has not forgotten your service." Mike, who had maintained his composure throughout the morning's harassment, found himself momentarily overcome by the gesture. "Admiral," he said quietly, "that's very kind, but I was just trying to deliver coffee to the dock workers." "And that," Admiral Hayes replied with a slight smile, "is exactly the kind of service that defines the best of our naval tradition, taking care of people, no matter how small the gesture might seem." Only then did she turn her attention to Petty Officer Rodriguez, who stood at rigid attention, his face pale with the understanding of what his career had just become. "Petty Officer," the Admiral said, her tone shifting to the kind of command voice that had once directed battle groups in combat operations, "you will return to your vessel, you will return to your station, you will file a complete report of today's incident, and you will await further orders." She paused, letting the weight of her authority settle over the young Coast Guardsman. "More importantly, you will spend the remainder of your career learning the difference between authority and respect. Authority is what you carry in your rank and your uniform. Respect is what you earn through your actions and your understanding that every person you encounter may have served their country in ways you... More importantly, you will spend the remainder of your career learning the difference between authority and respect. Authority is what you carry in your rank and your uniform. Respect is what you earn through your actions and your understanding that every person you encounter may have served their country in ways you cannot imagine." Rodriguez could only nod mutely. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated in the face of the Admiral's controlled fury, and the overwhelming display of naval power surrounding him. Admiral Hayes then did something that surprised everyone present. She turned back to Mike Sullivan and extended her hand in a gesture of equal respect. "Mr. Sullivan, on behalf of the United States Navy, I want to formally apologize for the treatment you received today. Your service to this nation earned you the right to be treated with dignity and respect, and we failed in that obligation." Mike shook the Admiral's hand, his weathered fingers meeting her firm grip. "Admiral, I appreciate that, but I've been dealing with bureaucrats and young officers who don't know their history for a long time. This isn't the first time, and it probably won't be the last." "Perhaps not," Admiral Hayes replied, "but it will be the last time it happens without consequences. The Coast Guard will be implementing new training protocols, and this incident will serve as a case study in what happens when we forget to honor our veterans." As the formal confrontation began to wind down, something remarkable happened in the waters around Liberty's Call. The civilian boats that had gathered to witness what they thought would be a routine harassment began to approach, their occupants wanting to pay their own respects to the elderly veteran who had commanded such an extraordinary response from the Navy. Captain Sarah Mitchell, who had initiated the chain of events with her radio call, brought her sailboat alongside. "Mr. Sullivan," she called out, "I'm Captain Mitchell, retired Navy. I was the one who called this in. I want you to know that what happened here today was an honor to witness." Other boats followed, fishing vessels, whose captains were themselves veterans, pleasure craft, whose owners had family members in the service, even a Coast Guard auxiliary vessel, whose crew wanted to distance themselves from the actions of their active duty counterparts. Each approach was handled with the same dignity that Mike had shown throughout the morning's ordeal. He thanked each person for their support, acknowledged their service or their family's service, and gradually transformed what had begun as a public humiliation into something approaching a floating reunion of the naval community. The dock workers he had been trying to reach with his weekly coffee delivery had heard about the incident over their radios and had launched their own small boat to join the gathering. "Mike," called out Tom Rodriguez, no relation to the Coast Guard petty officer, a retired Navy chief who supervised the civilian workers, "we heard what happened. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Tom," Mike replied, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "Just a misunderstanding that got a little out of hand." But it was more than a misunderstanding, and everyone present knew it. The incident had exposed a gap in training, a failure of institutional memory, and most importantly, a breakdown in the respect that should flow naturally between generations of service members. Admiral Hayes, observing the spontaneous gathering of support, made a decision that would have lasting implications for both services. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "I have a proposition for you. The Navy is always looking for ways to improve our training programs, particularly in the areas of military history and veteran relations. Would you be willing to share your experiences with our junior officers, not as a speaker or a celebrity, but as a teacher?" Mike considered the offer carefully. He had spent years trying to remain anonymous, content to serve in small ways without drawing attention to his past. But the morning's events had demonstrated that anonymity wasn't always possible, and perhaps it wasn't always desirable. "What did you have in mind, Admiral?" "Nothing formal, nothing that would require you to relive combat experiences or glorify war. Just someone who could help our young officers understand that the veterans they encounter in civilian life often have stories worth knowing, service worth respecting." The offer represented something Mike hadn't expected, a chance to turn the morning's humiliation into something positive, a way to ensure that future encounters between young military personnel and aging veterans might be handled with more wisdom and respect. "I think I'd like that," he said finally, "as long as it's about teaching respect, not about making me into some kind of hero." Heroes, Admiral Hayes observed, are often people who don't think of themselves as heroes. That's exactly the kind of perspective our officers need to hear. The immediate aftermath of what would later be called the Harbor Incident was swift and comprehensive. The Coast Guard District Commander, Rear Admiral Michael Torres, arrived by helicopter within an hour of the Pacific Fleet's response, ready to begin damage control operations that would ultimately reshape inter-service protocols. Petty Officer Rodriguez and his boarding team were immediately relieved of duty and transported back to their base for what would become the most thorough investigation in the district's recent history. The preliminary report, filed within 6 hours, would become required reading at Coast Guard training facilities across the nation. The incident had been recorded by multiple civilian boaters, and by evening, edited versions were circulating on social media platforms under hashtags like Respect Our Veterans and Navy Cross. The footage showed not just the confrontation, but the extraordinary naval response, creating a powerful narrative about the importance of honoring military service. But perhaps the most significant immediate change was in Mike Sullivan himself. For years, he had carried his service quietly, content to remain anonymous and serve his community in small, unnoticed ways. The morning's events had stripped away that anonymity, but they had also revealed something he hadn't expected: a hunger among younger service members to understand their history and connect with the veterans who had paved their way. Within a week, Admiral Hayes had arranged for Mike to speak at the Naval Academy, not about combat or heroism, but about the transition from military to civilian life, about finding purpose after service, and about the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their appearance or apparent station in life. The first session was scheduled for a small group of midshipmen, but word spread through the academy, and by the time Mike arrived, the auditorium was packed with everyone from first-year students to senior officers. His message was simple but profound: the uniform doesn't make you special, the service does, and the service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It transforms into something else, a responsibility to live up to the values you swore to defend. 3 months after the incident, Mike Sullivan was working in his small garage, performing routine maintenance on Liberty's Call's engine, when he heard a car pull into his driveway. Through the open garage door, he saw a young man in civilian clothes approaching hesitantly. It was Danny Rodriguez. The former Coast Guard petty officer had been through a transformation that was almost as dramatic as Mike's own journey from anonymous veteran to respected teacher. The disciplinary proceedings had been severe but fair: reduction in rank, extensive retraining, and a permanent notation in his service record that would follow him for the rest of his career. But more importantly, Rodriguez had been required to attend Mike's sessions at various military installations, listening as the older man shared his experiences and wisdom with new generations of service members. Over time, the angry, arrogant young officer had been replaced by someone who understood the weight of the uniform he wore. "Mr. Sullivan," Rodriguez said, stopping at the edge of the garage, "I hope you don't mind me coming by. I needed to apologize, properly this time." Mike looked up from his engine work, his hand still holding a wrench, oil stains on his work clothes. He studied the young man's face, noting the genuine remorse, the humility that had replaced the earlier arrogance. "You already apologized, son, several times if I remember correctly." "Not really," Rodriguez said, stepping slightly closer. "I apologized because I had to, because the Admiral told me to, because I was in trouble, but I never apologized because I understood what I had done wrong." Mike set down his tools and turned to face Rodriguez fully. "And now you do. Now I do." Rodriguez's voice was steady, mature in a way that hadn't been present during their first encounter. "I didn't just disrespect you that day. I disrespected every veteran who ever served, everyone who ever wore the uniform. I turned the Coast Guard into bullies instead of protectors." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But more than that, I forgot that everyone has a story. Everyone deserves dignity. I was so focused on asserting my authority that I forgot my real job was to serve and protect." Mike nodded slowly, recognizing the genuine growth in the young man's words. "That's a hard lesson to learn, but an important one. What are you doing now?" "I'm still in the Coast Guard, but I'm in a different role, training new recruits, teaching them about inter-service cooperation and veteran relations. Your story, what happened that day, it's become part of our curriculum." Rodriguez smiled ruefully. "I tell them about the worst mistake of my career and how a Navy Cross recipient taught me more about leadership in 30 minutes than I had learned in 5 years of service." "Leadership isn't about making people do what you want," Mike said, echoing words he had shared in dozens of sessions with young officers. "It's about helping them become who they're supposed to be." "Yes, sir, and that's what you did for me, even though I didn't deserve it." Mike extended his hand to the young man. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes, son. That's how we grow." As they shook hands, Rodriguez felt the weight of genuine forgiveness, not just for his actions, but for his ignorance. The incident that had nearly destroyed his career had ultimately become the foundation for a better understanding of service and respect. 1 year after the harbor incident, Mike Sullivan stood at the podium of the Naval War College, addressing an audience of senior officers from all service branches. The monthly Veterans Voices program he had helped establish had become one of the most popular continuing education offerings in the military, drawing participants from across the country. But the most meaningful change wasn't in the formal programs or the policy modifications that had resulted from his story. It was in the small daily interactions between service members and veterans, the increased awareness that heroism often wore ordinary clothes and spoke with quiet voices. The harbor where the confrontation had taken place had become something of an informal shrine to the incident. A small plaque had been mounted on the pier, not commemorating Mike's Medal of Honor service, but honoring all veterans who served with quiet dignity in their communities. Liberty's Call still made its weekly runs to deliver coffee to the dock workers, but now Mike was often joined by young sailors and Coast Guardsmen who volunteered their time to help with the deliveries. The simple act of service had become a bridge between generations, a way for current military personnel to connect with their heritage. The Coast Guard had implemented the Sullivan Protocol, a comprehensive training program that emphasized respect for all civilians, particularly elderly individuals who might be veterans. Every Coast Guard station in the country now displayed a photo from the harbor incident, showing the massive naval response, with a simple caption, "Every person has a story worth respecting." Rodriguez, now a chief petty officer, had become one of the protocol's primary instructors, sharing his own story of transformation as a cautionary tale and an example of redemption. His presentations always ended with the same message: authority without respect is just bullying with a badge. But perhaps the most profound legacy was in Mike himself. The quiet anonymity he had treasured for decades had been replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his active duty years. He had become a bridge between past and present, helping young service members understand that their work was part of a continuous chain of service stretching back through generations. On warm Tuesday mornings, when Liberty's Call cut through the gentle swells of San Diego Bay, carrying coffee and companionship to the dock workers, Mike often reflected on the strange turns life could take. A routine harassment had become a teaching moment. A moment of humiliation had become a source of pride. A breakdown in respect had ultimately created stronger bonds between the services. The bronze Navy Cross still rode in its wooden case in his tackle box, but it was no longer a private reminder of distant heroism. It had become a teaching tool, a way to help young officers understand that valor came in many forms and that the greatest heroes often wore the most ordinary faces. As he guided his boat toward the naval pier, Mike could see young sailors and Coast Guardsmen waiting to help with the morning deliveries, their eagerness to serve evident in their postures. They represented something important, a generation that had learned to look beyond appearances, to see the potential for heroism in every person they encountered. The incident that had started with a flare gun and harsh words had evolved into something beautiful, a renewed understanding that respect was not something to be demanded, but something to be earned through service, humility, and the recognition that every person carried within them the capacity for greatness. Behind them, the harbor sparkled in the morning sun, its waters reflecting the gray hulls of naval vessels and the white sails of civilian boats, all sharing the same space, all part of the same community. It was a fitting metaphor for the lesson Mike had taught through his quiet dignity and patient wisdom. We are all in the same waters, all part of the same story, all deserving of the respect that comes with shared humanity and service to something greater than ourselves. The story of the Harbor Guardian had become legend, not because of the naval response or the media attention, but because it reminded everyone that heroes walk among us, often unrecognized, always deserving of our respect, and forever ready to teach us what true service really means. In the end, that was Mike Sullivan's greatest victory, not the battles he had won decades earlier in distant waters, but the hearts and minds he had changed in his own harbor, creating ripples of respect and understanding that would extend far beyond any single confrontation, touching lives and shaping attitudes for generations to come.